discovered Ron, he introduced me to Robert, and I realized, holy smokes, when you look at the Hebrew, there's so much more under the surface than what you're seeing when you read, the King James Version. And so that just sucked me in.
Welcome to Rettle's Pub.
Okay, so to kind of introduce our next guest, it's Robert Williams. I haven't seen Robert. I don't know. We haven't talked in a very, very long time, like 20 years.
Probably, since the forum days.
Yeah, to kind of give everybody an idea, we had Ron Lennox on a few weeks ago. Me, Ron, and Robert were all in the same circles of friends back on Faith Child. And were you on God Place as well? Or did you just start off on Faith Child? Yeah, I wasn't on God Place too long. Go ahead.
Yeah. I vaguely remember you guys. It was really funny when you and Ron mentioned me. You guys were describing me, and I was like, I don't remember myself being quite like that at all.
Yeah, you always. I just always felt like you were a kind guy, right? I mean, we would say stuff, and
I guess you always have a much harsher self-judgment than what others think of you. So that's kind of funny to hear that.
I think we all have that to an extent. I think I'm an asshole about 90% of the time, but then people are like, you're really not an asshole. Except Mason. Mason always thinks I'm an asshole. I can't hear you at all. Always? Okay. Well, Adam's just projecting his assholery on me. That's what that is.
That's it.
Robert, it's a pleasure to meet you. It's actually a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for coming on, man.
Yeah.
And likewise, guys. Yeah.
So I don't know, Robert, if you've listened to any of our stuff, but if you have somebody, Mason, just so you know, somebody listened to 33 episodes yesterday. So I don't know how they even pulled that off, but they started on episode 2 and worked their way all the way up to Amanda's first one, I think. So I thought it might have been Robert, but I don't know who would be like listening to Rettle's Pub all day. I mean, that's like 15 hours of listening. So it may have been multiple people, but that's crazy. So anyway, that's a brief introduction about Robert. I don't know much about your background and all that stuff. And so we started Rettle's Pub as a place to have a place to where, because I don't proclaim Christianity anymore, but I have this spiritual pursuit that I chase, or practice, as Mason likes to say. So we kind of wanted Mason still proclaims Christianity. I don't. We wanted to have a place where we could talk about the differences between us, and we brought Ron in. He's obviously not Christian at all or spiritual to an extent, and so we really wanted to have a place where we could talk about whatever we wanted to talk about. Hence the idea of the pub, where in a pub back in the day, you would have had conversations about Christianity or spirituality and politics and all these things. And so that was the idea. So we wanted to get you on. Ron suggested it, and wanted to get you on, kind of let you go through your history, what you've been through as a past. I know we're all pretty much ex-UPC. And so just kind of give us an idea of what you've went through, the process. I remember you were pretty, I don't know if you were strict UPC, but you were pretty stringent UPC as far as this is the way it is, maybe not the holiness. I don't remember any of that. I just remember you were one of the ones that would challenge me on some of my thought processes, but you would never do it. That's the reason why I said you were just a sweet spirited guy, is because you would never be like, hey, you're going to fucking hell. It would be more like, no, I disagree, and here's why I disagree.
Right.
So kind of give us your history, Robert, and what you went through, and
Sure.
After you go through that, we can talk about whatever, and me and Mason may break in and have thoughts or whatever. So go ahead. Sorry, I'll quit interrupting you now.
No, you're fine. I was raised, actually it wasn't UPC, we were Apostolic, which was the same thing, just not associated with the organization. I guess you can consider me third generation. My grandmother was the one who first joined the Apostolic Church, and then my dad was already born then. He was an adult, so a few years later he came in, and then my brother and I, we were both raised, the whole cliche, sleeping under a Pentecostal pew. That was us. All my life I was raised in. And it's funny because there's the town I grew up in, Silsbee. It's pretty small, 7,000 people tops. I think one time I counted at least 34 churches that I could identify. This was back before the internet. I was driving around town and just talking to people. And so, yeah, city of 7,000, you had 34 different churches and probably at least 4 or 5 Pentecostal churches. There was one pretty sizable UPC church there, and it actually split off from our church back in, I think, the 60s. It was a big flap, so one of those things where we didn't talk to them, they didn't talk to us kind of thing.
Yeah,
for the most part. Well, it wasn't until our generation. I think our generation was the first one to start challenging that because we had friends, made friends in school, and so, but yeah, the older generations, it was still a pretty sore spot, I guess. So, yeah, we pretty much believe very similar to the UPC, but the whole idea where the UPC does it, where you draw a circle and you draw it tighter and tighter and tighter, and you have people who say, well, maybe I want to watch television, and then you have a bunch of people say, no, we can't do that, and they split off and make a more conservative version. So we were pretty conservative. I mean, the standards, you had to have shirts down to your elbows, past your elbows. There were a few churches in our fellowship that were worse. They actually made people wear the sleeves down to their wrists. But women couldn't cut their hair. The whole holiness code was very, very strict. And so I grew up, that was all I knew. It was kind of, the way I thought life was. And it was funny because I grew up in a pretty amazing neighborhood. It was one of the, I don't know if they exist too much like this anymore. It's where the parents would come out of the houses and stand in the street and talk to each other for hours. And, we'd get together and have like block parties and everybody would come. And there were only a few people on my street or on my block who were Pentecostal. We had Baptists and Episcopals, and so I had friends who were of other faith traditions. And it made for some strange conversations at times when you got to talking about religion. But for the most part, it's kind of like, you had that life and then you had your church life. And, I've just recently begun to refer to it as a cult. For the longest time, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I think especially for people who are in the apostolic faith, their idea of a cult is something completely different. And so, but as far as the markers of having, a very strong authoritarian person at the top, it's the pastor of the individual churches, and you pretty much don't question him. And the idea that, your life pretty much is intended to revolve around the church. And, there were times I kind of went through different seasons. Sometimes I would, spend a lot of time with the people in my neighborhood and my secular friends. But then there were times when, especially revival season, and it was like something they were always pushing for. We got to have a revival. The last revival just ended, and they're already scheduling the next revival. But they pretty much, it was all your life revolving around what's going on at the church and at the church. And so, I mean, I think the first time I spoke in tongues, I was 10 years old. And again, that was highly stressed, I guess, in the UPC and in the apostolic faith. Your salvation kind of hinges on the fact whether you can speak in tongues or not. And it's funny because I'm pretty active on Twitter, and I see people, they post a lot of speaking in tongues videos. And some of them are from the more charismatic, and some of them you can tell by the way that people in their dress, it's Pentecost. And, a lot of people ridicule and say, they're just making it up. It's performance art. And for me, it's like, some of it is. But then you watch some of it, and especially from my experience, it's like it wasn't performance art. I mean, it was pretty much equivalent to psychological abuse, because your existential being hinged on whether or not you could get lost in that state to where you can speak in tongues. And God knew if you were faking it, so you didn't fake it. And I mean, it's funny because some people did. They just they faked their way through it. And it's kind of funny, supposedly you have, the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit leading you, how little discernment there was concerning that. It was like so easy to fool somebody into thinking that you were legit when, and so I know a lot of people who did that. And I think, in some cases it was probably for their survival. They were just trying to get by as best they could. And so they did what it took to navigate that circumstance. But for me, speaking in tongues is always a very heavy psychological thing. I mean, I had duress and pressure and stress during that process of trying to break through to that point. And so, yeah, it's kind of funny. I actually, this past year, I started going to spiritual abuse therapy, and I ended up doing a session. It was it's called accelerated resolution therapy. It's kind of like NLP, a little bit neuro-linguistic programming. They kind of do a repetitive action that gets your brain focused on it, and then the instructor's walking you through a scenario, and it allows your brain not to get in its own way, and you can answer and kind of. But I did an accelerated resolution therapy on this one specific incident that I was 11 years old when it happened, and I didn't realize how heavy it still was, but it kept coming up when we were in therapy. I would mention something, and she would say, what's the earliest you can remember? And I'd say, well, I can remember this one time. And after about the fourth time, she said, I think we need to move on and do one of these sessions. And it was really amazing because I go through the process, went through the script, and afterwards I didn't really feel any different. And she said, you might have to do it again. And so I felt better, but I didn't, it wasn't life-changing. But probably over the next 2 weeks, man, my psyche just started bringing stuff to the surface, man. It was just like it was cutting the cords and it was floating up. Stuff I hadn't thought about in years that I didn't even know was related. And I was like, well, I guess I'm dealing with this. I was finally at the point to where I was trying to invest in myself, invest in my mental health. And so I started dealing with those things, and it was just amazing how there were so many things, touch points throughout my entire life that were connected to that trauma that was related to, to having that need to speak in tongues, that I didn't even realize it until I said, my brain finally managed to get out of its way. And, so yeah, it was something. But I lived, said all my life as an Apostolic Pentecostal. I got married at 25. I actually met my wife in the UPC chat room that preceded God Place. It was I'm not sure it was like UPCI.com. I think it was actually an official chat room. So I met her there, and she was from Ohio. I married her. We moved to Texas. And, it was really hard for her because Ohio Pentecostal is different than Texas Pentecostal. Oh, yeah. How Texas is. It's intense. It ramps up. Everything's bigger in Texas. It applies across the board. So she was having a really hard time dealing with some of the things. And, there were certain things that were part of the church I grew up in that as I got older, I could recognize and know that they weren't good. Racism was one of the big things. But it wasn't until she was there and I was getting her feedback and realizing from someone who didn't grow up with it, how she was reacting to it. It kind of, it opened my eyes to like, I really should probably do something about this. But it's really funny. I think I was probably around 12 years old. I was at a friend of mine's house, and his dad at the time was not religious at all. He was very secular humanist. And we were talking about something, and I just dropped the N-word. He was just threw it out there, and he jumped all over me. And I mean, he was nice about it, but he was very firm. He's like, he pretty much told me it was immoral to say that word. And I'm sitting there thinking, here I'm a 12-year-old Pentecostal kid thinking, what is this sinner correcting me on this? But I know he's right. When I heard that word over the pulpit at my church, it was just common. And so, little things like that, I've always been the kind of person, I guess, I'm very introverted. And so you read in the Bible about different characters who said they tucked it away in their heart and thought on the, they heard a prophecy, they just put it away in their heart and, kind of went on their life with it to see if it would come to pass. I kind of been that way about things. And so things like that were inconsistencies, I would just kind of tuck away in my heart. And, at some point I just finally realized, man, I'm sure giving a lot of benefit of the doubt to things that really I don't agree with, and they aren't making my life better, and I guess one of the breaking points as far as me leaving the church that I grew up in, when I finally left, it's when I graduated college and I got a couple of job offers. 2 of them were in Ohio, and so I took them and got out. But I had been pretty much looking for a way out before then. But we had this family, again, it was a generational family at the church, and the granddaughter had backslid and wasn't going to church anymore. Well, she came and prayed at the altar one night, and then the next service she brought her boyfriend, and her boyfriend was a black guy, and he went to the altar and prayed and started speaking in tongues. And so everybody was like really happy, but they didn't like the fact that it was a mixed couple. That was way not okay. But this guy, he got in and he was committed. He was just like hungry as could be. And so my wife and I befriended him. He's a really cool dude. And we were getting ready to go to an out-of-town youth rally. And we were supposed to drive by the church and pick him up on our way out. And we finally got there. He wasn't there. We waited and waited, 15, 20 minutes. Never showed up. So we went ahead and left and did our thing. And then got back. He wasn't at church. For like 2-3 weeks went by. And finally I went and I asked this guy. We had several members of our church who were in law enforcement. I was like, somebody probably knows what happened to him. So I asked. And it turned out that he had returned back to his home to get dressed for the youth rally. And his girlfriend was there with another guy. And he said, look, I'm just trying to get my stuff and get out of here. I got somewhere to be. Well, they ended up calling the cops. And this guy had a pass, had a record. And so they took him to jail. And he had been in jail. And then they shipped him off to, I don't know, wherever they sent him, Huntsville, somewhere. And I was thinking, there was never a prayer request for this guy. None of you guys went to bat for him. And I'd seen him go to bat for people who were favored. And it's like, for them, it was just this problem solved itself and went away. And I was like, man, the story just echoed through my head, the account of Jesus saying, in that day, many will say, Lord, we've done many things in your name. And he said, when I was in prison, you didn't visit me. When I was sick, you didn't, it's like, it just condemned me so bad because I was like, here was this guy who was committed and he was hungry, and he just got thrown away because he didn't fit what they wanted at the assembly. And so, it's things like that just really, it soured me, and, I had been through my rebellious phase, as well. And, I guess probably most Pentecostal kids hit that at some point. And so I had made some stupid decisions as well, but, in spite of that, I always came back, and I always, when I was 18, I started college. Before that, I went from 1st grade to 12th grade at a Christian school based out of the church. So I never went to public school except for kindergarten, which really doesn't count. So all I knew was Christian education, and it did not prepare me for college. When I hit college, it was just, everything was just completely different. And so a lot of stress. And at 18, I started drinking, and I got in deep and fast. And so, there would be times that I would go to church during a revival, and, I'd feel conviction. I'd go down and I'd pray at the altar, I'd bawl my eyes out and speak in tongues, and beg Jesus to deliver me from this thing that had me. And then 2 hours after that service, I'd be drunk again, just, completely blackout drunk. And I remember asking myself so many times, why isn't this working? I've been taught my entire life that speaking in tongues is the answer. All you gotta do is touch Jesus, and he's gonna. And it doesn't work. And then eventually, I, managed to, through whatever process, separating from friends and willpower, to work my way back into church and, to get away from drinking. And I didn't drink for probably 20 years after that. But I convinced myself, that I just wasn't committed enough. It always comes down to you. It's like when something good happened, you sure as hell better give God credit for it, or something bad's going to happen. When something bad's happened, it's probably your fault. So you need to shut up and take it. And you don't dare blame God for it. So it's like, I've started calling that the God card. I made a meme that has an AI generated picture of this old grumpy man, and it's called the God card. And it pretty much, states on it all the exceptions of things that you can't blame God for. But yeah, so, like I said, I'd had my issues and my failings, and, I guess you could call it backsliding. So when I finally moved from that church, I had 2 job offers. Both of them were from my wife's uncles. One of them was from a church, Pentecostal church in the town where I now live, and the other one was across the state on the other side of Ohio. It was her uncle had an industrial design firm, and he was looking for a graphic designer, and that's what I was going to school for. So I took that and went and worked there for about 9 months, and then things just kind of weren't working with his business as a whole, and so eventually he decided to shut it down about the same time that I thought, maybe I made a mistake and went to the wrong place. And so we went and talked to the pastor, who's my wife's uncle here, and he hired me. And so I kind of just seamlessly moved from that position to this. And here in Ohio, that's when probably the worst spiritual abuse that I've ever experienced, it started, because on paper, I was being trained to take over the church. He was getting older, and he was looking for someone that he could, pretty much train in his stead. And it was funny because he was ex-UPC as well. He actually developed a different view on the Godhead, which really pissed the local UPC in Ohio off. I guess he had decided that the whole idea of oneness, it was more like two-ness. It was, you had the Father and you had Jesus, but they weren't the same. And pretty much Jesus had earned his position by living a perfect life, and then, became God, if you will, was bestowed his divinity at his baptism, because, he had proved himself worthy. So, he had this idea, and then he also believed that when you're baptized, you receive the Holy Ghost, but you don't have to speak in tongues. It's just given to you as a gift, and then you get to decide what you do with it from there. And he kind of took Paul's idea of his writings about speaking in tongues, and he's like, you need to do it at home, pretty much. If you're going to speak in tongues and go crazy, do it in the privacy of your own home. Don't disturb church with it. But it was one of those things where, I was raised as a fundamentalist all my life, so whoever could give the most convincing argument the most passionately, you were right. And so, I started looking at things from his perspective and reading the verses the way that he was interpreting and showing and stringing them together. And, it was a challenge. I pretty much had to completely reinvent my faith. And so I was at that church for 4 years. And I was, I guess, an associate pastor. It got to where I was preaching. I would preach a Sunday morning, and then another associate pastor would preach Sunday night, and then we would flip the next week. So I was preaching Sunday morning or Sunday night every single week, probably for a good, I would say, 2.5, 3 years. And it was funny because at that point is when I reconnected with Ron, and I hadn't talked to him for 10 years probably. But there was another forum that came up. I think it was called Bible Talk. I don't know if you guys made it to that forum or not. Some guy in Connecticut had
I vaguely remember the name of it, but I don't think I ever participated. I think I had left because I've been out for, I don't know. Yeah, I'd been out for 15 years at this point. So
15 years, yeah. So yeah, it was probably, you might have already been gone at that point. But I connected with Ron, and he had connected with Robert Allen. And, as someone who was like preparing sermons weekly, man, it was it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, because I took that responsibility seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Here I'm, I'm teaching and guiding a flock, and I was more of a teacher than a preacher. There was very few times that I preached passionate, driving to the altar messages. But I had it in me. I could do that. I just preferred not to. I preferred to strengthen the body, and so most of my stuff was more along the lines of teaching. And so when I was Robert Allen was just as fundamentalist as any other group that I'd been a part of. He had a different way to spin it, and a different sales presentation. And so I just got sucked into that big time. And I remember when I told the pastor at the church that I felt it was God's will that I should grow a beard, because I was convinced that it was biblical to grow a beard. It didn't go over well at all, And then I started wearing the fringes on the belt loops, pretty much, which is kind of completely not the way Jewish people do it at all. But I'd become convinced that that was, if I was part of this covenant with God, then that was one of the responsibilities. And so, like, the very first time I ever showed up at church with those on, and again, I was really bad at communicating. I kind of just did things. I was hungry and following, and so I was just adopting some things and doing them. And I didn't really talk to the pastor beforehand about things, because I knew on one hand that he wouldn't agree with it, but on the other hand, it was like, this is my personal journey. This is me, my relationship with God. It's not yours. But the first service I showed up with Zeet, the little fringes on my pants. I got called to the office, and he pretty much said, "Are you going to wear those?" I said, "Yep." He's like, "Okay." And then the next staff meeting, he rearranged how he was doing services, and I never preached again. But without going into, I'm not going to name anybody because it's kind of futile, but I mean, the verbal abuse that I got from the pastor of that church. I mean, I got called in the office, yelled at, fist pounding the desk. When I didn't comply, he called my wife in, griped at her because she wouldn't turn on me. And I mean, it was constant. I mean, there was nothing I could do that was right, no matter what I did. And me, I was wide-eyed and committed. I was trying to build the kingdom. I was pouring myself into it. Anything that was asking me, I would do that and more, because I just wanted to do what was right. And that was kind of always my attitude was, find what's the most right thing and chase it. So, but yeah, doing that, and then never being able to do anything right, being constantly abused. And then it got to the point to where when I would start integrating some of the stuff that I was learning from Hebrew and some of these concepts, I would preach things and people would come up afterwards like, "That was amazing," and then I would talk to them 2 months later and they would say something that would let me know, you didn't understand a thing I said, but it was the Pentecostal expectation of, that was a good sermon, Pastor. And so I don't know, I got a feeling that I was probably talking over people's heads a lot. Again, I didn't know how to do anything else. That's kind of, I'm more, I guess people tend to refer to me as peg me as an intellectual. I don't really feel that way about myself, but I am studious. I like to dig in. And I mean, even now, I'm not religious at all, but I still follow Bible scholarship, and I dig in and I read the Bible, and I study it because I think it's interesting. It's a very influential document, and I think it has, it needs to be put in the right context. And a lot of times it's not. It gets renegotiated and reinterpreted to match where people want to go with their beliefs, so I went through there, and man,
Up next on Reddle's Pub.
I remember my daughter had just been born. She was just a few months old, and we were getting ready to go to a Wednesday night service, and things had just gotten so bad. And I just stopped the car and told my wife, and here she was, her first child. She was in the middle of postpartum. And I said, "We're not going." I said, "I'm not going back ever." And she Oh, it was so hard for her because she was, had her own trauma, and from the time that she was 16, she grew up in that church under this pastor, and so she had been abused. One time, I think she went and got her hair permed, and it didn't take, and burned some of her hair, and her hair fell out, and she was called to stand up in front of the entire church as an example of why you don't get your hair permed.